Hi. Thank you for coming out during Fleet Week and the really nice weather. I am Colleen Diez. I am the lead user researcher here at DO. We're going to talk today about, positioning your product with user research. I want to tell you guys a little bit about my story. So a long time ago, many, many years ago, I actually used to be a developer. If anybody recognizes this kind of code on the screen, then you know what kind of developer I was. But I was working for many years, like coding on a daily basis. And I was working on a project where basically, the designers came up with a new design for an email newsletter, and they asked me to code it up, and we launched it. And within 24 hours, we had really, really horrible customer feedback. People were, writing in like, what's happening over there? Like, what's going on? And so the team was really upset, obviously, and they went back to the drawing board and they redesigned it. And 2 weeks later, we relaunched it. And then again, within a day, we had these really angry emails, and people were like, I've been a customer for 10 years. Take me off your list. Who's working there? So around that time, I was asking other people on the team, like, didn't anybody show this to customers? And the response that came back to me was, I'm sure somebody did, but really nobody had. And a friend of mine who was a UX designer, she suggested, well, maybe you need some user research. And I was like, what's user research? So she handed me a book about usability testing. I read it cover to cover, and I was like, I could do this. So I did. So I partnered with the PM on the project, and we basically ran usability testing in secret with customers at lunchtime or after hours. And we gathered all of this data about how to really improve the product. And so, we presented it to senior leadership, and they were like, this is great, do more of it. And I was like, awesome, but I still have this day job where I'm a developer. But I had also realized through that whole process that my passion was really for connecting with customers and helping them improve their experiences. So I decided at that point to actually pivot my career into user research. And so I convinced the company to let me pilot a program for it. And eventually that led to a full-time role as a user researcher, but that's basically how I made that transition. And I tell that story too because I think sometimes people don't realize that they can actually create their own career paths. And I will say that like other researchers that I've talked to usually have some sort of interesting path like that. So anyway, this is what I do nowadays. My day-to-day involves a lot more with colorful Post-its and looking at a lot of data. So yes, we are going to talk about pivot or protest, yes. But first, I have a questionnaire for you because I'm a researcher, duh. So I just am really curious, how many folks here actually work for a startup? Show of hands. A few? Okay, cool. Any Hatch members? I think we've already asked that question. Yep. How many people have ever used a DigitalOcean tutorial? Okay, all right, awesome. How many people in the room are tech founders? Okay, a few. How about developers? One? All right, that's great. Designers? Yep, okay. Researchers? You get extra credit if you're a researcher. Thank you for coming. Anything else? PMs? Any PMs? Or marketing? Well, I know you. Anybody else? Does anybody else not on that list? Yes, you. What do you do?
Just very small business, so lots of things.
Okay.
All on a computer.
All on a computer.
Trying to sell things.
Trying to sell things. Okay. Sales-ish? Sometimes. Okay. Okay. Cool. I mean, why am I asking this? I mean, I think one of the things to convey is that when we talk about research, you know, we always want to tailor our research for the audience. So I'm really just trying to get a sense of like who's in the audience, and you know, this may actually affect the kind of information or the way that I present this information to you. Did anybody attend last month's Hatch 101 talk, or does anyone watch it? Oh, great, I'm thrilled. So last month, Rafa Mojica, he actually presented painless and efficient ways to perform usability testing. If you did learn something from this last month, I want to talk to you after the talk today. I also will not be covering what Rafa covered last month because I think you guys can actually go online and watch that video. It's available on YouTube. What I do want to cover today are some things like this. I hope that what you get out of this talk today is that you learn some easy research methods that you can actually experiment with and have a better sense of how to prioritize the right features before you start building. I also hope that you learn how to use quality metrics to iterate and determine launch readiness. And I hope I'm going to offer you some tips for synthesizing data and making sense of your research. And then also, we're going to talk about when to pivot or when to protest. I also have this black box on the screen. I think sometimes there's a perception of research that researchers go off into this black box and they conduct their research and they come back with findings and then they deliver it, and no one really sees what happens under the hood. And that's not how research is done here at DigitalOcean. So we really believe in transparency and sharing data and research. And actually, like most of the people on staff, they conduct their own user research. So our designers do, our marketing folks do, our PMs do, our customer support team, they all do their own user research. And I see it as my job to help them in that and to help them, basically like self-service research on their own. The other thing before we, start diving in, I just want to define a few of these terms. So what do I really mean by pivot or protest? I think pivoting really is about, when you have a big idea, or you have your high-level strategy, or you have your minimum viable product, and it's not viable. When these things are really just not working, like you need to pivot. And protest, someone actually told me they had never heard protest used in this context before. So what do I mean by the term protest? What I mean is that when you have conducted research, you already have data about your customers, you found the right audience, and you know that. You've actually validated your idea, then I think you should protest. I think there are some tips and techniques that I can tell you about to when you know your audience, but you need more clarification. So we'll talk about that. For anybody who works in a startup or works on a product team, positioning your product is never easy or obvious. These are just a few examples of big company brands where maybe you've seen these things, maybe you haven't. Dove, a couple of years ago, actually redesigned the shape of their body wash bottles for people's body types. I think this was controversial, to say the least. There's also the case of like the $1 million Pepsi smile. The new Pepsi logo, they spent $1 million to redesign the logo, and apparently there's a smile in there somewhere. And then also AOL's logo redesign, they redesigned it with a period. Why? I don't know. Maybe I didn't do the research there, so I don't know. But let's talk about maybe some real life scenarios. Like you're working in a startup, you have a product idea, what are some potential problems where research can actually help you with positioning? So maybe you've talked to a bunch of users, but you didn't get any consistent feedback. What might be a reason for that? Like what could be potential issues? I think initially my instinct is to say, did you do enough research? Or did you use the best research method to get the answer that you needed? Or let's say you sent out a survey. You conducted a survey. You got results where people said, oh yeah, I like your product. I'm going to buy your product. But then when you launched, your adoption was a lot lower than you expected. Maybe it's not the product. Maybe it's the way that you're actually marketing the product. Or maybe it's something to do with the design of the product. Or maybe you didn't understand your customers' real needs. So those are some potential issues. And then finally, you have a startup idea, but you're not sure who your target users are or what features you should build first. I would say from a research perspective, maybe you haven't yet done validation of your product market fit or the value proposition for your product. To the research. So when we initially start thinking about like talking to customers and conducting research, I always tell people like, let's think about like, what are you trying to learn? What are the questions that you're trying to ask? Is it that you are trying to explore those unknown unknowns? How many people have seen this matrix here, or these quadrants? Anybody? No? So the idea here is basically that, when you're first starting out, you start with what you know, right? You realize, do a gap analysis of like the information you already know, and then you move into information that you don't know. But what's hardest to do, and where research can actually help you, is in those things you don't know that you don't know. So those unknown unknowns, can really only be found by conducting something like exploratory in-depth interviews. If you take nothing else away from this talk, I would say this is one of the key pieces. It's the questions that you ask that determine how you get the answers in research. So, this is a great visual from the Nielsen-Norman group that basically explains like the questions that you're asking, like how many or how often or why or how to fix something. These actually help guide you to the right research methods. Just to like walk through that a little bit. Let's say you're asking like why people are behaving a particular way, or what are people doing? The only way to really understand that with research is through qualitative evaluative research, which means doing lean validation, like in our Hatch 101 talk last month, or usability testing. Similarly, like if you were trying to learn why, but also what are people saying, you would want to conduct in-depth interviews, or maybe do field visits, or even participatory design. I will make a note, I did not put surveys on this list. And that really is because surveys are more often a quantitative tool for understanding like how things play out at scale, and not always good at answering the why questions. So what you may want to do though is combine those surveys with other types of qualitative data. So best practice is really to combine methods, both qualitative and quantitative. And why do we do that? The truth is that every research method has both its strengths and its weaknesses. And if you actually combine methods, then you're mitigating the weaknesses, and you're actually creating more confidence in the results overall. But also, you using multiple methods, you're actually creating something new. You're actually synthesizing multiple types of data to create a cohesive story. One of the questions that I get asked very often, and usually by folks who are, maybe a little bit more junior in their careers, is what's the difference between analysis and synthesis? So here's just a very quick breakdown. Analysis, really is about breaking up a bigger concept into small pieces, and studying each part of a problem separately. So it assumes this concept of reductionism. You're reducing all of this big piece down to, the smallest possible chunk that you can. Analysis is also very problem focused. So if you're trying to understand the problem, you want to analyze. You want to break things down into small chunks and analyze. But then you need to move into synthesis. Synthesizing is about actually combining those smaller analyzed pieces into a larger, cohesive, whole system of understanding. It always, always happens after analysis. You've got to go through that process. You've got to do the analysis before you can actually synthesize everything together. And synthesis also is very solution-focused, and it's about storytelling. It makes the solution obvious. So first you analyze and prioritize. And how do you do that with user research? So you can prioritize user feedback. One way is by quality, meaning like themes or categories. So some of the methods that we typically use as researchers are, you can do affinity or pattern mapping, which there's a good example here, where you're putting like one idea on a Post-it, from interviews that you've done. And then, the team is collaborating to sort of make sense of that data and move those things around into groupings or categories or themes that actually, have bigger meaning. Word clouds are another tactic for doing that. Customer support tickets are a great way to actually, prioritize user feedback. You can use a prioritization matrix that will actually tell you like what you should be working on first. And then also by your user's own words and language. So, we here at DO sometimes take the transcripts from our interviews and we actually break down the transcripts, the user's actual quotes, and make sense of those so that we look specifically at the pain points, or we look at, the actual opportunities that people are using in their own words. Another way to prioritize user feedback is via quantity. So the number of customer support tickets, is often gives you a good sense of priority. Some people also prioritize feedback by their most valuable customers. So the idea here is that like 80% of your revenue is generated by 20% of your customers. This can be helpful, but I would say it can also be tricky. Because you're biasing yourself towards those high spend customers, and those high spend customers might be super fans of your product or company. So if your problem is that you don't realize who your potential users are, those high spend customers are not going to give you that information. You can also run a funnel analysis to see where drop-offs are. Or actually pivot tables. As a researcher, pivot tables are some of my best friends. But the best way to prioritize user feedback is actually by combining both quality and quantity. So how would you do this? Really, you would do a task analysis across the whole customer journey. So you would look at all of the tasks that users are completing across their entire journey. And then quantifying those things. So some of the ways that we do this here at DO is we look at the averages of our single ease question, which is how easy or difficult was that task after users completed the task or didn't complete it. We also look at severity and frequency of usability issues. So basically, if there are severe usability issues that are preventing people from actually completing their task, those are more important than issues that are less severe and more frequent. So we use that as a method of actually prioritizing. And then finally, if you have engagement analytics for what you know are a customer's important workflows, you can prioritize data based on that. But then you want to tell stories. So what do I mean by story? So synthesis, again, I think is not just storytelling, but actionable storytelling. So all of your customers or potential customers are already asking themselves, how will your product or your app make my life better? When you're telling stories with data, you need to make sense of this data in a way that appeals to the broadest audience possible. So that means hitting all 3 points of that triangle. Basically, you're speaking to credibility of the data, you're speaking to the logic of the data, and you're also speaking to your audience's emotions and feeling. But also storytelling is about narrative arcs. So a Google search basically for narrative arc will bring up a whole lot of different types of images. But another way to look at, how do you tell a story with data about your user, for your user? This is not a new concept. It's been around. I've heard it mentioned for many years now. But your user is the hero of their own life, basically, and you and your team are the mentor. You are Yoda, essentially. So research helps us understand that we're not designing or we're not building just for like a one-off moment in a user's life. We're trying to understand their entire journey, but we're trying to make them the hero of their own journey, of their own narrative arc. And I love this quote from Kathy Sierra. She says, "I'm your user. I'm supposed to be the protagonist. I'm on a hero's journey. Your company should be the mentor or the helpful sidekick, not the orc, not the bad guy." So there are some tools that we use as part of research to actually help with the storytelling, with synthesis. And I mentioned a few of them earlier, but the prioritization matrix is one. Customer journey maps are great because they also show you that narrative arc. They show you that story across the customer's whole journey. Mental models are also a great tool that we use here at DO. It's a way of actually visualizing someone's workflow or their process, but it's less focused on their actions and more on what's going on in their head, like what's happening in their mind. Customer empathy maps are also a great tool for understanding what you observe users do versus say versus think or feel. You saw an affinity map earlier. We also use user flow diagrams to understand process. And personas are also a really good way of actually, making your user into the hero of their own journey. It's a great way to represent that. And then also here at DO, we actually frequently use jobs to be done as a framework for really, really understanding people's internal motivations and essentially like what makes them choose DigitalOcean versus some other product or app or competitor. So here's an example for you. I have frequently seen in my career some analysis or reports that look a lot like this. Let's say there's maybe like 3 facts or rates that are listed, something like conversion rates dipped 40% in January. Average time on the checkout page also increased by 3 seconds. And the design team changed the hero image on the website homepage on November 25th. Does anybody want to take a guess here? Like what is the story? What is tying all these 3 things together? Are these 3 things, how are these 3 things related? If you were going to tell a story about this. That's true. There are different time periods, yeah. I think your point was great, that anything could influence these things, right? Like, how do you pull them together? User research is the only way to pull these things together. So these three things, in reality, the story was, we did user interviews in January. Let's say this is for a shopping site or an e-commerce app. But people told us in January that they were burned out and broke from holiday shopping, which resulted in 40% lower conversions. Those that did complete purchases, who actually did buy stuff, they actually hesitated because they weren't sure which styles, like fashion styles, would be in for spring, which was also evidenced by a 3-second increase in average time on the checkout page. And no one cared that the homepage hero image had changed. So this is just an example where, you know, it's important to realize that, like, you can make a lot of assumptions just by looking at individual analysis or individual facts, but it's really, you know, that in-depth user research that really helps you understand what is the customer's actual motivation, like what is the real story here. So maybe you know the story, maybe you totally understand the story, but you're wondering, like, well, okay, I get it, I think, but maybe there's some other stuff I don't understand. When should I protest? And when I say protest, I also mean iterate, meaning that, you know, protest means you already have a viable idea. You already have a viable strategy or an MVP. And maybe you've got good data and you've already established your value prop, but you're getting low signups and you don't know why. What are some things that you could try here? You could try split tests. You could try experiments, A/B test to actually, you know, better understand. So when I was working formerly at a different startup, we had really good research that was telling us that there was this new course. So basically, I used to work for an education company, and we were designing and building an online course for people to learn. And we had such good data. It was telling us, like, you know, people want this. They're going to sign up. They're going to buy this. They're going to do it. But then, you know, we posted a landing page and we had no signups, and we couldn't figure out why. There was, like, you know, there was traffic, but no one was actually, like, signing up with their email. So someone on the team was like, we should just, maybe it's the call to action on the page. Maybe we should try something different. So we went back to the user interviews and we actually looked at what people had told us about why they were interested in this. And the experiment that we ran was actually with 2 different CTAs on the landing pages. So one of the CTAs was more related to like the cost of the course, like, you know, that it was affordable. And the other one was actually more about how it would help them learn and benefit them in the future. And which one do you think performed better? The one that helped them, would benefit them in the future. So I think that, you know, user research is not just only about, like, interviewing customers and, you know, looking at these qualitative methods. It also does involve quantitative sometimes. And again, that's what helps you tell a much more holistic, cohesive story. But let's say your problem is something like, well, we've got high conversion, and users tell us that our product is easy to use, but we need to scale. Or let's say, you know, you've launched your MVP, everything is, you know, working, but now you're like, I have this whole feature list of like 10 other features, and I have no idea what to build next. Or maybe the problem is that you're not sure if your product is ready to launch. So some other techniques that you could use to do these things are, you know, you could do pre-launch prototype testing. You could also use something that we use here at DO called a Cano Model questionnaire that actually will help you understand which potential features to build. And I'll talk more about it in depth in just a second. And then you could also do launch readiness testing, you know, where you benchmark quality scores using the following kinds of metrics. Maybe you've heard of some of these. I will say that a lot of the time when I've worked on product teams, people launch products based on some externally imposed deadline. Like, the CEO wants us to launch by next quarter, or we've got to launch in the next 3 weeks, or we're getting funding and so we have to launch. But that doesn't always help you build a good, high-quality product. If you have the chance and you can build your product and benchmark the quality of that product or the usability of that product before you actually launch, and determine like how to do it, like what the right level of quality is, then your product is much more effective. A little more detail about the Cano model, because I don't know that anybody else is familiar with it here. But it's basically a way of putting features into a questionnaire to marry a user's perception of both the function of the feature as well as their potential satisfaction. And the idea is that you would prioritize your features according to what must-be features are and performance, meaning that people both expect them and they would like them. But it also gives you a sense of when there are features that nobody expects but find very, very attractive. So something that might actually delight your users. So we've actually used this here quite a bit for different products. I know the folks on my team really like this as a technique, so I just wanted to share it with you. I mentioned launch readiness a little bit earlier. The high-level way to do this is that you would predetermine those quality levels based on either like your user's most important tasks or based on particular attributes or heuristics. So some folks are familiar with like a heuristic evaluation. And you can do this basically with like your subject matter experts as a way to review it before launch, or even with users before it actually launches. And the idea is that you keep testing and iterating until the product or your feature meets those quality scores that you've determined are the right level of quality. But when should you gather more info? So maybe you don't yet understand your target user's core needs. Maybe you don't know what their important tasks are. Or maybe your current product or marketing strategy is just not working. Or maybe, I hear this frequently, you haven't noticed any patterns in users' attitudes or pain points or behavior. So some methods to try here, are really exploratory research or mental model research, field research, where you actually go out in the field and observe people acting and behaving in their natural environment, or potentially card sorting or tree testing as a way to understand how people think. And I would also put surveys here, but only if they're done well. But when should you pivot? When it's not working. Maybe it's not that everything is not working. Maybe it's just some things are working better than others. So let's say you have one product or one feature that's far outperforming the others. Or, again, the same scenario, like user interviews said they'd buy your product, but at launch, you get very lukewarm sales or adoption. Or maybe the people using your product are just not who you expected. I've definitely worked on products where, we thought the people that were going to adopt the product right away were going to be like VIP, high-spend customers, and it ended up not being those people. Or maybe there's also too much competition, you haven't differentiated enough, or maybe you got the story or the original synthesis of your data wrong. So I'm going to say these are advanced research methods, but you too can try them, and you should try them if you haven't. Field visits are a great way. I just mentioned like going out into the field, observing people, but also jobs to be done. And desired outcomes. And what do I mean by those? So, jobs to be done. How many people have ever heard about jobs to be done? A few. Okay, so the idea behind Jobs to be Done as a framework is that Jobs to be Done helps you understand why people choose your product or your feature apart from your competitors. It really helps you understand like what's motivating them to actually, if they were going to switch solutions, why would they switch to your solution as opposed to anybody else? So an example is, this is the typical format. From a DO perspective, when I don't have time to learn how to manage my infrastructure resources, I want to find the easiest and simplest cloud provider so that I can get back to doing what I love, which is coding. In that format, I haven't said anything about the actual solution. I'm looking for some kind of cloud provider, but the format of these jobs is that, you know, you're using users' own words to basically identify why they would make a change. But not having a particular solution in the format allows your team to actually innovate and come up with more creative solutions. So when we do these interviews here, we actually go out and, you know, we talk to folks about what was their worst case scenario, what was the worst thing that ever happened to them with that experience, and then contrast that with what is the ideal experience. And when you get those types of stories, you understand the extremes, so then your team can actually, you know, avoid the negative extreme and push more towards the positive extreme when solutioning. Also, we synthesize these jobs to be done across the whole journey. So we write customer jobs across the whole customer journey, and we affinity map them into larger, higher level themes. Part of the process is that we then build a mental model, and we actually run like a touch point solutioning mapping workshop with our internal teams once we've gone through this process. How many people have ever heard of user stories? Know what a user story is? Yes. So user stories typically are about the solution. They are actually telling you, like, you know, what you're going to implement, what you're going to build. The idea with combining that with jobs to be done is that all user stories roll up into the higher level job to be done. Once you have jobs to be done, you know, you can actually identify part of that job to be done was the desired outcome, which is how the customer, the user, is seeing progress or improvement in their own life. And this goes back to that whole other concept that we were talking about a few minutes ago about meaning. How do you see meaning and how do you make meaning for your customers? So we also use this, and we have actually used the desired outcomes to quantify those motivations or those outcomes across a very large segment of our whole entire user base and audience. So, you know, we have a scorecard where we actually measure these things, and then you can take that information and analyze it for, like, where are your customers underserved or adequately served, not just by your own solution or your own app or product, but across the entire market of your competitors. This also really helps you speak to your audience in their own words and in their own desires. So one example too I have here at the bottom is, like, this is how we're talking directly to our audience using the language that they've told us, that they've given us. So I hope you've learned something from this talk. I would say, you know, I think we've covered those other things. Just a quick reminder that, like, the questions that you ask really determine the technique that you're using, either for research or for synthesis. And if you're interested in learning more about these methods or how to do these things, these are some really great resources that have been, you know, pivotal in my life, in my career. This is not, you know, a whole list, comprehensive list by any means, but these are really great, to reference. The final thought I would leave you with is, you should use research in order to make meaning for your users and for yourself. Thank you.